All right, welcome everyone to week 4 of Discover Your Inner Guru. I can't believe it's week 4 already. It's been so interesting to me how different this round of Guru has been versus the first round. And again, for those of you who didn't take do the original beta test, it's looking really different this time. And I think it was important for me to do it the way I did it the first time so that I could be prepared for this the way we're doing it this time. And so it's just really important to me that you guys are really learning the practical application of what it looks like to discover your inner guru, to learn to listen to that inner voice, to become confident in the answers that you receive, to learn how to manage your emotions in a healthier way. And so last week we kind of went deeper into this concept of observation in context of it's a space of awareness, right? And awareness and observation can be sort of an open observation or awareness, or it can be really specific and really honing in on those things. And we got more specific last week. And we talked about two specific ways or aspects of awareness to consider. And the first one was discernment. And there were several distinctions or discernments, rather, that I invited you guys to make. And one of them was distinguishing between false versus truth, or really refining what feels real to you in the moment versus what's actually true. And although it's important to acknowledge what's real, at some point you'll want to really clarify into what's absolutely true, because that's where the real learning happens, and that's where you're empowered to actually create something different. And we talked about discerning between what belongs to you and what doesn't, and how we tend to take on energy that isn't ours, or belief systems, or whatever. We kind of borrow them or take them on in an effort to save or fix or lighten another's burden, and it's actually a false sense of supporting other people. It actually compounds and expands the negative energy. It doesn't take it away from that person. And then we talked about distinguishing between the present moment and are you in the present, or are you worrying about the past or fearing the future? All right, so those are some distinctions that we talked about. And then we talked about the second aspect of awareness, as in the transparency and honesty, where we talked a little bit more about shame and a choice that you can make for yourself to choose into love, so that you can really see what's true. And then we talked about personal responsibility. We talked about victimhood, and that victimhood mentality versus actual victimhood, because there is a difference, right? Anyway, so that's what we talked about last week, and I've just been feeling like, again, I want to just continue delving deeper into what we've already addressed. Before we do that, I just want to spend a little bit of time reminding you that things take time. You know, we're in a 6-week course, and you don't have to master these skills in the 6 weeks. This is just, just be aware that this stuff takes time, and there's kind of a layering process that happens. And for some of you, you know, it's taken years to develop some of the unhealthy patterns and habits. And so it might take months to rewire the brain and reinforce those more positive ways of being. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this idea of patience, which to me really is the law of the harvest, right? What you reap what you sow, and it's like that line upon line, precept upon precept. When I've been growing my garden this year, I don't just automatically get fruit. I had to prepare the earth. I had to do all kinds of things and follow sort of an order, a progression of development, in order to get the fruit that is now bearing on my beautiful tomato plants, for example. And I made a jar of pickles yesterday, which I was super excited about. Sorry, just reading a text from one of you. Sounds good, Melissa. So, I'd like to share some thoughts about this idea of law of the harvest and the time that it takes. And there's sort of phases of development that we need to go through in order to learn a new skill, in order to really create new, solid, permanent neural pathways in the brain. There's a book that I've been reading to my family, actually, that I don't know if anyone's aware of this because it's old school. If anyone is a Stephen Covey fan, it's this book, and it's probably backwards, but it's The Spiritual Roots of Human Relations by Stephen Covey, and it was published in 1975, before I was even born. And so it's really, really old school. And so personally, there's some things in there that I kind of are like, I've discarded because it doesn't ring as true to me, but there's so much truth in here to gather from. And some of my favorite things that he talks about is this, using the 6 days of creation to describe the different stages of growth and development, and how we all have this, I don't know if we actually have 6 stages, but that's kind of the metaphor, right? That it took 6 days for the Lord to create the world. And so I believe that our bodies and our lives and our minds are our own worlds that we're creating for ourselves, right? And so we get to go through those same stages of development. And if we skip a step, then we go into a space that he describes as borrowing our strength. And we'll go into that in just a little bit, but I want to kind of describe these phases really quickly before I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs, because I just love how he says some of these things. This is true with all the phases of life, with the development of all skills, whether it be piano playing or communication. It is true with individuals, and it is true with groups and families. In all of life, there are stages or processes of growth and development. We know and accept this fact of process in the area of physical things, but understanding it in the emotional area, in human relations, and even in the spiritual area is less common and more difficult. So he says that it's impossible to ignore or shortcut this development process, okay? Because, I mean, imagine that you try to go and play on the Olympic team of tennis when you're still at level 1 or 2 of learning, right? First of all, you wouldn't even make the team, right? But if you tell your friends and boast to your friends, yeah, totally, I was varsity tennis, and then you go out and play tennis with them, I mean, it's not going to be long where you're going to be totally exposed, right? Because you're going to suck. So we can't skip any phase of the process, he says. He says, in fact, it is contrary to nature, and any attempt to seek such a shortcut will result in confusion and frustration. If I am at day 2 in any field and desire to move to day 5, I must first take the step toward day 3. A 1,000-mile journey begins with the first step, one step at a time, line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little. This is the law of the harvest. You reap as you sow. The law of justice, which is a natural law of God. And I find that this is something that I think is forgotten today in just sort of this instant gratification world that we live in. Everything comes to us so easily, so quickly. We're in the age of information, and it's like, I want to know how to be an expert at something, and all I have to do is get on Pinterest and Google it and YouTube it. People think I'm super talented. I've made this painting here, which is like amazing, right? But I just YouTubed it, you guys, and I just did it. So it's like, so there's some things that we can kind of just do that come to our fingertips that are easy, but the things that matter most, the things that have to do with really developing our character and emotional intelligence, which is super essential in this whole discovering your inner guru, right? We have to develop those skills, and it takes time. It takes time for our spirits to kind of grasp the concepts, but then it takes even more time for the physical body to then incorporate it in that tangible way, right? It takes time for the brain to wire itself and rewire itself. It takes time for it to integrate into the DNA, and it's a process in the physical body. What does the scripture say? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The body is so amazing, but it's just slower. We can understand a concept, but until it's really written upon our hearts, and then until we actually practice it, it doesn't integrate fully in creating the results that we desire, and it just takes time. Okay, so then he talks about what happens when we try to skip a step or whatever. Okay, so it's this idea of borrowing your strength, and how borrowing your strength from outside sources becomes a weakness for you. He uses an example of a parent and how he was very immature in how he treated his teenage daughter. And I think it's okay, my sister's on here, but I'm just going to share a little bit of personal experience. I grew up with a dad who is an amazing man, and I have so much love and respect for him because he was in his own way a chain breaker. But as he was raising his children, it was very clear to me, even as a 5-year-old girl, that he was not fully developed. In fact, I remember watching him chase one of my brothers around the dining room table with the belt, kind of snapping the belt at him to scare him. And I'm 5 years old, and I remember thinking, my dad's acting like a child. And like it was so interesting. I have such a vivid memory of having that realization that my dad is a child and he doesn't know how to behave in this situation. It's like he's literally snapped and doesn't have the emotional intelligence to stay calm and to reason and talk it through with my sibling. And I observed this a lot growing up, where there was sort of an emotional neediness with how my dad raised us and communicated with us. And it made it very difficult for me to have respect for him. And so when it really came, I mean, I was afraid of him, so then I would do things because I was fearful of getting spanked or punished or whatever. But once I got into high school and he had mellowed a lot, because I'm 12 out of 13, so he definitely mellowed a lot by the time I got close to leaving the home, it was really hard for me to really take much stock in what he said, because he didn't really earn my respect. And so that's what he talks about, this idea of like when people haven't progressed through those stages. So say you've got a grown man who he's keeping a home, he's having children, and he's maybe spiritually doing all the right things, and maybe he's really, really good at working hard and providing for the family. And so there's other areas where he's developed to maybe a level between a 4 and a 6. But then emotionally, he's still like at a level 2, because maybe there's some dealt with trauma or something, which was the case for my dad. Like he just had a lot of childhood trauma and a lot of anger towards his mom, and he didn't have the resources or the understanding of how to even deal with that pain. And so basically in certain situations he would borrow his strength from the belt. He would borrow his strength from his physical, height, and his his loud voice, and sort of demand authority from us, but it was not coming from within. It was a borrowed strength, and so in our eyes it became a weakness. And these are the reasons why it becomes a weakness. There's three reasons why borrowing our strength outside of ourselves will create weakness. Number one is that I totally lost my place. Okay, so the first weakness is that he builds weakness within himself, right? So when you're borrowing strength from a position or authority alone, it reinforces your own dependence upon external factors to get things done in the future, right? And so, and secondly, it builds weakness with the other person involved, and that's what happened with us. So because the younger child, or I'm just talking that he shares a similar example in his book, but I'm kind of sharing it through my dad because it's really similar. Um, because I learned to act or react in fear, right? Um, it leaves very little room for reasoning, for freedom of choice, or for growth in internal discipline. So I didn't really learn discipline in certain areas because I was doing them out of fear, not because I understood that that was a good habit. In fact, I'm going to admit this, that when I got to college, even, I didn't even really know how to do basic hygiene, even. Like, it's like I left home and suddenly I was free to make all my decisions, but a lot of my decisions up until that point were made in total fear. And, fear of messing up, fear of getting in trouble, fear of getting it wrong. And so I kind of turned into a hot mess. And that's when my autoimmune really started to flare up for a long time because I didn't even honestly know how to brush my teeth often enough and things like that. And so then I found myself in really embarrassing situations with roommates, wondering why I was doing certain things. And I was wondering why they were wondering because I didn't know any better, And so I learned a lot of things through other people. And it was kind of humiliating because it was like I didn't know how else to function. And so it really created a weakness in me because of that. And the third way, it built weakness in our relationship. Our relationship became really strained, and it became really strained with his other kids. And it's taken years to heal those relationships. And now it was so nice to go back to family reunion as I've done my work. I know that he's done his work in the way that he knows how, but I just had to at some point disconnect from any attachment to how he was going to show up and how he was going to change his viewpoint or way of being. But as I've changed my heart and I've learned how to get my strength from internal sources, from the divine and from within, it doesn't even faze me. It doesn't trigger me. It doesn't even bother me anymore. It doesn't matter how he shows up. And he totally pulled a few stunts this last reunion that I just could have been really deeply triggered by. And it was just like, it's kind of how he rolls, and you just kind of let it go, and it's such a cool place to be. And so as we're learning these skills, as we're learning emotional intelligence and learning how to manage these emotions, as we're learning to become more aware and shed the shame and the judgment, we're going to learn how to more easily connect to the divine for our answers and for our strength, and to connect to who we really are and what we want. What do we want to create? So we get in the driver's seat of creation here. And it's no longer this unconscious reaction space, but it's like really conscious awareness of this is what I want, this is where I'm going, and I'm going to be disciplined to get there. And it's just a really cool space. So just keep in mind that this takes time, and be patient with those 6 levels or the 6 days of creation within yourself. Just and ask yourself, in certain areas when you have maybe a breakdown or when you're observing yourself in different situations, maybe ask yourself, what level of creation am I at right now? What level of development am I at? Am I still at a level 1? And maybe that could help broaden your observations a little bit. Kirsten, go ahead.
Do you have a list of those? I just went on Amazon to get the book, but I'd like to know like what those 6 levels are, or will you put it on your site or in your like on a file or something?
I can do that. Yeah, I can do that.
Okay,
It probably won't be
thanks.
up until tomorrow, but yeah, I can do that.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Um, and keep in mind that your levels might look a little different from someone else's too. How you manifest your development isn't going to be exactly the same as another person. But you can kind of ask yourself, okay, and just trust to intuition for now, until I get that up. You can just be like, hey, do I need more development in this area, or am I borrowing my strength from a position of power or authority, or or my job. It's like, oh well, I'm awesome because I'm an executive. You know what I mean? Like, am I borrowing my strength and my self-worth of who I am from outside of myself, from sources that really aren't, they're not going to go with me when I die, right? um, but just continually connecting to who you are is really important in this process, and remembering that your worth is infinite regardless of what you do or say. And I feel like this is really key in letting go of the shame and the judgment. Because if we forget who we are, if we forget like how amazing we are without anything, without any success or accomplishment, we can just let it go, the shame and the judgment, and go, oops, I fell over. I guess I better get back up again and try again. You know what I mean? And so it becomes a little less of a big deal when we make mistakes. And we can still feel what I call that godly sorrow, because it's like, I've been disconnected from God's love for a long time because I made that choice. Or, oh man, I'm disconnected from my own love, or I disconnected from like who I really am and what my vision for my life is. I've let that go because I've chosen into some beliefs and actions that have totally taken me off track. And it can be a moment of, oh, okay, well, when did that happen? And if you're in observation without shame or judgment, there's a lot that can be learned from that. And it doesn't mean that you're not feeling sadness, but the shame and judgment clouds the perspective. And we're going to go into a little bit more of that in a minute. Okay. So there's at least, there's these steps of development. Respect that, be patient with it, be aware of where you might be on those in certain aspects of your life, and be honest with yourself. Okay, well, I guess I'm only at a level 3 on this. I get to work on that. And that kind of creates some awareness of where you get to focus some time and energy. And don't try to shortcut the developmental process. Don't try to skip any steps. Be really patient with those steps, because you'll just fall on your face. Like a toddler, when he's first learning how to walk, we see it all the time. He just starts running before he's really ready. And he just, poor Adam, my 16-year-old, when he was 1, his whole front of his nose was a giant scab because he went running down the driveway, and it was an incline, and it just, he just didn't have everything that he needed in order to stay upright. And it was kind of funny because my mother-in-law had pictures scheduled, professional pictures, and she had them photoshopped out because she wanted it to look perfect. And I was like, it's okay, I still have pictures of his scab, so for my for my records. Anyway, all right, so then I'd like to talk a little bit about, just in this taking time, I want to talk about vulnerability for a minute, because I think vulnerability is often seen as a weakness, and that's vulnerability is something that is kind of maybe hand in hand with shame or judgment. But when we feel vulnerable, it's human nature to feel like create some kind of counteraction to not feel vulnerable anymore, to create some safety, because it's like our natural response is the fight or flight. Okay, I either need to flee or I need to fight and feel strong again, because feeling vulnerable is weakness. And I'd like to open your perspective to the idea that vulnerability is power. And this is why. Because vulnerability leads to humility. And when you're humble, you're more teachable. And when you're teachable, this is kind of cliche, you learn more, right? And knowledge is power, right? That's the cliche phrase, is knowledge is power. But it's so true. The more you know, the more you see, the more you understand, the more you are empowered to actually create something different, create a different result. And so that could be maybe a phrase that you add to that sheet of questions or phrases that you might say to yourself to remind yourself of what's true, or to support yourself in this observation without shame or judgment, is that vulnerability is power. Vulnerability is strength. I'm going to learn something here. And so I'm going to sit in this vulnerability, and I'm going to allow myself to breathe through it, relax into it, because I know that if I can just learn to be comfortable in the discomfort, that I'm going to learn something and that's going to be worth it. Yeah. And that takes discipline. It takes a willingness and a choice to sit with it, to see it, to deepen your awareness, right? And so that's something I wanted to share, just share a little bit before we head into going more deep from last week. So I wanted to, any questions or thoughts on that before we move on? We're good? Hi, Silts, did you guys have a thought?
Just one thought that I had too when you were talking about vulnerability and why it's so powerful. One thought that I had was that because vulnerability is truth, when you're willing to be vulnerable, you're really willing to live truth instead of trying to mask it in some way.
Thank you for sharing that. I have goosebumps all over my body. I'm going to write that down because it's my new favorite phrase. Vulnerability is truth. I love that. Thank you for sharing. Does anyone else have anything they want to share before we move on? I don't know. I just felt like I needed to spend some time on this because, we're in week 4. You've done enough work now to start to work the packed sediment deep in your pond. You're starting to bring the bulldozers in and kind of mess with it, and things are starting to loosen up, and maybe for some of you a Pandora's box has been opened up, and it could feel like terrifying because I'm inviting you to get out of your comfort zone. I'm inviting you to step out of what has felt safe all these years, because it's what you've already always known, into the unknown, into something that's really new, and that can be really scary. We by nature fear what we don't understand. And so hopefully this conversation is helping any of you that have been feeling especially vulnerable or impatient, or maybe judging yourself more harshly on maybe how you should or shouldn't be getting this, or like if you're finding yourself still in week 4 repeating some old habits that you think you should have shifted by now. Not necessarily, and maybe it's not ready to shift. Maybe you haven't learned enough. Yeah, maybe you haven't been vulnerable long enough. Maybe you're not humble enough, right? Because it's really important to totally surrender to that space of vulnerability so that your eyes can really truly be opened to seeing that truth. Okay, so I wanted to go ahead, Kirsten.
I just had a quick question. I felt a little bit stuck this week in one of a situation that came up, and I was like, oh, I'm doing good. I took a breath. I'm observing how I feel, but I couldn't get to the bottom of why I was feeling that way.
Okay.
It didn't make sense to me. Like, I didn't understand it. And so, like, what do you do when you're like stuck there, I guess?
So first of all, I invite you to let go of any judgment that you're stuck or not stuck.
Okay.
Because that might be just a perception that you're stuck. You might
Okay.
feel stuck because you have a desire to not have that feeling anymore, or not have that perspective because you want to learn and grow. But from what I've experienced is, if I'm still in a rut, or if I am perceiving that I'm stuck, I may just haven't observed it long enough.
Okay.
So if you can possibly intentionally release any need to fix it, any need to make sense of it, because in week 1, it was at week 1, I think we talked about how human nature, we want to make sense of it, and
Yeah.
trying to make sense of things, it takes us out of the present moment. And so making sense of it usually happens in hindsight, you know what I mean, as we're kind of looking back and going, kind of pondering, and it's actually helpful sometimes to kind of look back and learn from the past, in a purposeful, aware way. But when you're in the moment and it's not shifting, I would just say, even though this isn't shifting like I would like to see it, I'm just going to love myself anyway. And it's my intention that next time this happens, if it happens, that I'm even more aware and more open next time. And so that it's kind of a natural evolution and unfolding that happens rather than you trying to go in and mold it and tweak everything and like make it happen and force it. It's like going with the natural flow of the energy rather
Hmm.
than tampering with that organic flow. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, any other questions or thoughts before we move on? Go ahead, Diana.
I really liked what you said. If you try to make sense of it, and then my brain went somewhere else, so I forgot what you said. If you try to make sense of it, what was the rest of the?
It takes you out of the present moment.
It takes you. I loved that.
And,
Okay.
and can actually, I'll add to that, can actually send you back into shame and judgment. And shame and
That,
judgment is a spectrum, right? And it doesn't mean that we're in this, oh no, I'm so bad all the time. It might just be that it's like we're just judging that it needs to be different than it is, rather than just seeing it for what it is. Does that make sense? Like,
mhm.
like it needs to be different than it actually is, but no, but that's actually what it is. And so if you see it and accept it for what it actually is, that's where we can actually expand into that learning.
Perfect. Thank you.
Welcome. Great questions. Thank you, everybody. Okay. All right. So we're going to move right into going. I want to delve deeper into this idea of transparency and honesty. I was really super inspired actually by my teenager this week. As we've been trying to help him works through some things, and he's going to be 17 next month, and he has one more year before he kind of makes a decision on what he wants to do with his life after that. And he's kind of in a panic, and he's kind of spiraling in a lot of ways, and that's great. Hopefully he'll learn from these things. But he and I together made some observations of what was happening with him, and kind of starting young. He's so just to give you some background, he has ADHD and a parallel anxiety disorder, and he's combined types ADHD and inattentive, which means he's like way high on the spectrum of ADHD and has all the things that any ADHDer could possibly have to deal with processing, learning disabilities, inattentiveness, and in a difficulty quieting his mind ever, and just there's just a constant irritability and irritation that and anxiety that he deals with all the time. And so he's come a long way and he's doing so well. But one of the things that all ADHDers have in common is what they call rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So since even though there's a spectrum of ADD and not everybody exhibits the same symptoms in the same way, this is the one common thread that they all have, which is just a really heightened fear of rejection or paranoia of being rejected. And so for people with that kind of brain wiring going on, it's especially difficult to get out of the shame and judgment. The shame and judgment is really heightened for them. And so what has happened with him is this pattern of lying and being not on purpose. I wouldn't he's not a liar, but just sort of bending the truth in his own mind to himself, to where he kind of gives himself a false sense of reality so that he feels better about himself. Um, and so then he, in some areas of his life, has created kind of this alternate reality where he'll be in situations that he'll suddenly have an F in a class and he'll be just like shocked because it's like, what? I turned everything in and I did this and I did that. And then he'll go back and actually look at what was real, and so many assignments weren't all the way turned in, or he didn't finish all the questions on a test, or because he was just so fearful of getting it wrong, or being rejected or whatever, that he couldn't function in the moment. And so then he creates this like world in his mind of how he thinks things are happening. And recently he got let go from his first job because a similar situation where he thought he had submitted his time off to go on vacation with our family properly. And it turns out he didn't do it right and didn't follow up. And So he got let go because he was a no-show for several days of work, right? And so now he's kind of dealing with the consequences of that. And I just, as I was pondering this, I was shown this vision that I want to share with you guys that I think is so, I might get a little emotional because it was one of those complete awesome brain explosion moments. So this is what happens when we're not fully transparent or honest with ourselves. And it's difficult sometimes, because if we're like my son Adam, who has really severe anxiety and fear of rejection and things like that, it might be difficult because we're avoiding the truth because the truth might be too scary or bad or humiliating, right? And so it's I shared this metaphor of at our Q&A last week that I'm going to kind of remind, because not all of you were on there. But it's like we all have these shadow self parts of us, or these dark parts of us that we are ashamed of or embarrassed about or whatever. Or, you know, we kind of make this image up in our mind, and it's like we have this really scary, ugly, evil monster locked away in the cellars of our soul. And we keep it there, and we keep it locked up, and because in our minds we've led ourselves to believe that it's this horrible, nasty thing that if anybody ever sees it, or if we even look at it ourselves, it's going to be way too painful and, you know, embarrassing or shameful to face it. But if we were to really unlock that door and take that monster by the hand and walk it up the stairs of that cellar into the sunlight, I guarantee that all you will see is an innocent, dirty and hungry and neglected child. Not a monster. Because it's those pieces of ourselves that we've locked away, that when we were little and we heard people talk to us, or the interactions of while our brains were still developing, we decided things about ourselves that are so wrapped in this shame and this judgment and embarrassment and humiliation that we forget who we are, and those parts of our souls are kind of trapped in time. Those little girl or little boy parts of ourselves that haven't been fully healed and acknowledged, they're not ugly. They're just really neglected. And until we can bring it out to the sunlight and let things be seen for what they really are, those parts of us will never fully develop. We'll be continually borrowing our strength from false outside sources. We will continually try to skip steps of development, and show up kind of awkwardly in those parts of our lives because we're never willing to see the truth of those things. And so what happens is we're afraid of the judgment and shame and the humiliation, so things get stuffed, they get brushed under the rug, they get locked in this tidy little box of false sense of security and control. And then what happens at that point is we begin living in an alternate reality, like my son has found himself in. And completely, on some level, completely disconnected to what really is happening in the world. And so I see this happening in relationships a lot, where a spouse is really convinced that the other is abusive and narcissistic. And I mean, narcissism's a really popular subject these days. And it's being oftentimes falsely diagnosed by the spouse, because of this alternate reality that spouse might be living in, because they're not dealing with their own pain. They're not being fully honest and transparent with their own pain and their responsibility in things. So we live in an alternate reality. Our words, our thoughts, and our actions begin to cater to this alternate reality. And then we might go into victimhood, because we start to wonder, well, I don't know what's wrong with you guys. Then it's like the world against you, right? And it's all this victimhood mentality of blame and and not wanting to take personal responsibility. Okay. And then you kind of end up living confused. You find yourself in these situations of like, why are people responding to me why they are? My son was getting he's like, I just don't understand what happened, Mom. Like I went through all the things, and then when I go back and I check and I go, well, you actually didn't do all the things. And he's like, goes into this, oh no, and really down on himself, and he can't quite has a hard time breaking out of that shame and judgment. And so I have to continually remind him, I'm like, it just is. That's just where you were at. That's your phase of development. So, when you do your math classes, you're still at the phase of development where you're still learning how to turn in assignments after you finish them. And that's okay. That's just where you are. There's no shame in that. That's just where you are. So now that you know that's where you are, we get to put some contingency plans in place, maybe some reminders on your phone, there's other things that we can kind of put into place when we are aware of the truth, right? And can really connect to the truth. And it's so empowering. And I love watching him shift from this space of total shame and to just freedom and empowerment. And it's like this weight is taken off of the shoulders, right? All right, so then I want to talk about this false sense of security or comfort zone that's created in this space of dishonesty with ourselves, or this false sense of reality. We kind of create this comfort zone or false security or protective bubble around ourselves, and we might not realize we're doing it, but it's like we're trying to protect ourselves from the shame, the humiliation, the embarrassment, the rejection, all of that, right? But what's really ironic is this protective bubble personifies shame and judgment, right? Like that's what the protective bubble is. It's shame, it's judgment. And so we think we're protecting ourselves, but we're actually compounding the problem. And as long as we stay in this protective bubble, we're shielding ourselves from reality. And in our efforts to protect ourselves from the bad, or what we're perceiving or judging as bad, we're missing out on all the good. Brene Brown said something along the lines of, and I'm not quoting this correctly exactly, but she said something like, when you resist or avoid pain, you're also avoiding the equal amounts of joy and resisting the joy, because everything, joy and pain, yin and yang together, like we can only feel as much joy as we are willing to really deal with the pain, right? And so honestly, we're not helping ourselves, right? So we're missing out in this protective bubble. Excuse me. We're missing out on seeing what's true, which means we're missing all the good truth too, right? So we're protecting ourselves from the truth of our mistakes, maybe, and like avoiding seeing like, oh, oops, I messed up and that was awful and maybe I shouldn't ever do that again. But we're also missing all the good things about the truth and all the things that are going to help open our perspective to the learning, to the lesson. So we're missing the lessons that lead us to that knowledge and that understanding. We're missing a broader perspective, which is that ability to see the whole elephant. You know that story how all these blind men are touching parts of the elephant, and they're making a judgment as to what this creature is based on their limited perspective. But they don't even have any comprehension that it's actually an elephant, I don't remember all the different types of things that I think one man touched the trunk and said, oh, this is a a snake, or touching the tail and this is a snake, and touching the tusks and saying it was something other kind of animal, but they were really missing the whole point. And so we're missing out on that broader perspective so that we can see what's really there, right? And then we're missing ultimately the freedom to create different results. Because you guys, I honestly see this as another interpretation as the parable of the talents. Go with me on this one. I think we sometimes think of the parable of the talents as kind of like this, literally, like I better not hide my gifts and I'm a singer, so if I'm not using my voice and I'm not performing, then I'm hiding my talents and they're not multiplying. And honestly, this parable can be applied in so many different ways, because sometimes we want to hide our mistakes and bury them deep inside from the world, from ourselves, and we're ultimately trying to hide it from ourselves, right? Because we're so afraid of weakness, we're so afraid of what might happen if people see who we are, we're ultimately afraid of not being loved and that rejection, right? But if we can see our mistakes as a gift, as a precious treasure that can truly be multiplied, because when we make mistakes and we're in a space of observation, we're learning. And when we're learning, we're expanding, we're growing, right? And so these mistakes that maybe in the past we've judged as bad and wrong and the source of all rejection and lack of love, it's actually the doorway to expansion and growth if we allow it. So I'm inviting you to a perspective shift on mistakes and what maybe in the past you've perceived as wrong or bad or stuck, or in the moment you might feel stuck. That's what feels real in the moment, because I believe as divine beings of light and truth, we deeply desire love and connection, right? First and foremost. And we deeply desire freedom to create. We were given this gift of agency to create, and so it's innate in us to want to experience freedom to create and move and become. And yes, it's uncomfortable to our divine beings, our divine selves, to feel stuck. It's not just the natural man that doesn't like vulnerability. I feel our spirits, our souls, our divine beings don't like it either, because we want freedom to move. We want to create things. And so anytime we're in a space where there's not a lot of movement, even our spirits who are still developing might create a judgment there and might go, oh, I should be moving, or I need, okay, well, let's let the dust settle for a minute. If we can stop perceiving our mistakes as stuck or bad or evil, something to avoid, something to stuff, something to fix or get rid of, but rather something to be observed, aware of, and learned from, imagine the possibilities of what can happen for you. Imagine the growth, imagine the expansion. So this is what I wanted to talk about today. This is all I've got for you. I hope that this has been helpful. I hope that it is expanding your understanding of what this space of observation can do for you. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we wrap things up? Or celebrations? That's right. I had you guys think of your celebrations. And go ahead and unmute yourselves. Who do we have? So someone unmuted themselves, but you're not talking. Who do we have?
Oh, I thought you were having us all unmute.
Oh, That's okay too. Actually, go ahead and mute yourselves and just unmute if you wanted to share something, because then we don't deal with the background noise.
Okay.
I can't think of things to celebrate right now because I don't know. I feel like I could stand and cry.
I'm sorry. I'm having a hard time hearing you, Cindy. Is that you?
I just said I'm having a hard time thinking of celebrations because after all that we just did, I feel like I want to sit here and cry.
Would you be willing to share that with us? Can we observe with you? I wish I could hear you better. I'm having a hard time hearing you.
I'm gonna go over and talk on David's computer.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me better?
Yeah, much better.
I don't know, since we just got done with all that,
Okay, make sure everyone else is muted. Okay, go ahead.
I said I just feel really tearful since we just finished.
Where do you feel it in your body? Make sure you're breathing. Take a nice deep breath. Let's calm the parasympathetic nervous system. You're doing great.
I don't know where I'm feeling it.
That's okay. Yeah. Well, you're feeling the emotion. That's a good start. And if you could describe your emotion, how would you describe it?
I don't know, maybe just thinking about all the things I've missed out on because of I've been locked up.
Grief, maybe. All right. I understand that. Breathe into it. That's a really powerful acknowledgement. And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing it here, because you're not going to be alone in that. It's really natural phase of observation to, when you see the truth, to go into, oh man, like, I wish I had known this when I was raising my littles. You know, what could have been different? And honestly, there's power in allowing that grief to move and be seen. So I hope that you can spend time today sitting with that grief, letting it move, crying it out, writing it out, something. And hopefully maybe Dave can give you some space or hold space for you to do some of that. And I find it really helpful to write. And just, I used to hate writing, probably because I was afraid of what would come out on the paper. But now I love it because I can write, especially if you write on paper that you can throw away. I don't have to hold back. And I can get any of that judgment and shame. So this is actually a really good point to bring up, is it's really tempting when we're thinking, okay, we want to observe without shame or judgment, so let's stuff the shame and judgment. Right? And then we kind of miss the point there, and we're not like sitting with that. So maybe the shame and judgment is what we're observing. The grief of like the judgment of what should have been different. I remember working on a session with my dad once, and he just bawled and was like, if I could, I just wish I could go back knowing what I know now and do it again. I'm like, you'd have 13 kids all over again. He's like, yeah, absolutely, I would. And I said, but Dad, you didn't know. You can't go back, and you didn't know different. Things are just as they should be. And who you were for me has helped me become who I am. It's a gift. I didn't see it for a lot of years, but I see it now. And to be able to say that to him was such a blessing, but you're not alone in that. And it's important to feel the grief. If there's shame and judgment in there, write it down, observe it, sit with it. Don't shame and judge the shame and judgment either. Because if that needs to be seen, if that needs to be loved on and sat with, then do it so that it can move and not sit with you. Keep me posted on how you do. I'd love to get an update. And I'm inviting everyone else to just Care Bear stare some love to Cindy for a minute. And we're out of time. I'm going to close things up for the day, but remember Friday night at 7 p.m. I'll send the link. The link is still the same on the site, but just in case, I'll email you the link again. And hopefully you can join us. And yeah. All right. I love you guys. Have a great week. We'll see you Friday. See ya.